Okay, good morning. So we're still in the middle of the chapter 271, Reisha and Aleph and the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, discussing the laws of Kiddush. We're holding at Halacha Zayin, Halacha 7. So we discussed a little bit yesterday my suggestion in the interplay between the biblical and the rabbinic component of Kiddush vis-a-vis the recitation of Kiddush in davening. Namely, considering the fact that biblically speaking, all one is required to do is make mention of the Shabbos to sanctify it. And it's the sages who ordained that it should be done over a cup of wine. You're stuck in this problem where you fulfilled your biblical obligation before you've even made Kiddush, because you've already done it. Right? That was our kind of discussion. Now, I suggested, based on the wording of the Alter Rebbe, where he says that if a person must delay his Kiddush, he'll rely on his davening, indicating that in the first instance, the biblical Kiddush is fulfilled at the Kiddush when we're holding the wine. That was my suggestion. And considering the fact that we don't have any instruction which says, when you daven, have in mind that you're fulfilling your Kiddush, not now, but later. We don't have such an instruction. Meaning that the sage's institution of Kiddush, upon which we are relying, already has built into it this presupposition that we are only fulfilling our biblical obligation when we do so with the cup of wine. Now, if the circumstances are such that we're delaying the Kiddush, then we'll rely on the Kiddush of the davening. But in the first instance, if we follow the program of the Siddur as it's been laid out, considering that I am doing all of this because I trust the sages in their structure of how to pray, the implied stipulation is that I'm fulfilling my Kiddush when I make the biblical Kiddush when I do it with a cup of wine. And that was my suggestion. Yeah?
Have the meal in place of your Kiddush, is that biblical or
also rabbinic?
Also
so these are all rabbinic.
Wine,
correct. It's all rabbinic augmentation. The Torah says sanctify Shabbos as you begin. Torah also says you have to honor the Shabbos with a meal. So the sages put all this together into the structure, augmenting this experience.
So couldn't it just be that that it's just you still satisfy your biblical requirement at davening, and you just are left with fulfilling the rabbinic components?
If that were the case, if the case were that you fulfill your biblical obligation every single Friday night when you daven, that means every single Friday night when you make Kiddush at home,
so you're just
it's a new. So now you're adding a new level to the rabbinic enactment that you should repeat your bracha in order to do it online. It's a whole other level of rabbinic enactment, and then you run into the issue of, which we'll see a little bit today, if I'm making Kiddush on Friday night for someone else, and they didn't daven Meir, but I did, so I have a rabbinic obligation now. For them, it's a biblical, but I'm fulfilling their obligation.
You couldn't.
Or maybe I could. We're going to see a little bit soon. But there's the issue we'll run into, right? Which is why my suggestion avoids all that issue. Because to begin with, when I go through the process of my siddur, I rely and trust on what the sages are fulfilling, doing, and their institution. And their institution is built in. It's Lev Bezdin Masna Aleim. The heart of Bezdin stipulates for them. In other words, for all those who rely upon the sages' structure, their stipulations are implied in what I'm doing, even if I'm not aware of it. There are many examples of this.
But there's many. That's what I was.
There are other examples of this. So I used an example of Shema yesterday, but there are other more explicit examples.
Right.
In the Beis Mikdash with Karbanis, where Lev Bezdin Masna Aleim. The Rebbe uses it. The Rebbe uses this idea.
The Rebbe here also indicates that suggesting.
There's going to be more such indication. Yes, that's correct. But I want to. Okay, so right. There are other cases in which this is like this. The Rebbe uses it with respect to the mitzvah to write a Torah. The Rebbe suggests that throughout the generations, we don't find people, the minute they become bar mitzvah, writing a Torah, or as soon as they become bar mitzvah, fixing a letter in a Torah even. So the Rebbe suggests that when a Torah is owned by the community, it's the sages stipulation that this Torah belongs to every member of the community. And therefore, every time any member of the community makes a bracha, gets an aliyah on that Torah, they're owning the Torah for those 5 minutes. Just like, here's another example that Rebbe uses. For example, a lulav and esrog that belongs to the community. For many generations and in many towns, it was impossible to get a lulav and esrog for each individual. It's impossible. In the middle of Eastern Europe, where are you going to get a lulav from? There's no palm trees in the area. There's no esrogim either. So there was one guy in town who had enough money and resources and whatnot and started months in advance, and he got a lulav and esrog. Right? Now the halacha is the lulav and esrog has to belong to the person shaking the lulav and esrog on the first day. So what do they do with this community lulav and esrog? They had it in shul, and because it belonged to the community, the implied stipulation is that whoever picks it up to use it, for those minutes it belongs to him. Now you have to be aware of that, and the bezin to sit with him and say, "Here's a gift for you, give it back." It's stipulated by the communal leadership, without even stating it, that whoever picks it up, because it belongs to the community, whoever picks it up, it belongs to them at that moment. And the Rebbe says the same thing is true of a Sefer Torah. It's a big Kiddush that the Rebbe says that. But the point I'm making here is that this idea of the leadership or the sages upon whom we rely when we fulfill our obligation, that whatever they had in mind in their institution applies to us, even if we're not aware of it. So when the sages instituted that you should make Kiddush over a cup of wine, then without even being aware of it, that's when I fulfill my biblical obligation, even though I technically did it in Ma'ariv also. That's what I'm suggesting. Now, I'm repeating this because, as I mentioned yesterday, it's going to come up in a moment. And Rabbi Gipple emailed me, and I have his email on the screen. I'm going to read for you what he wrote. 3 different sources on this. And what I'm going to demonstrate is that my suggestion here avoids all the issues that these commentators are trying to state. So, opinion 1 is the Mishnah Brura, which writes that Kiddush is biblical in prayer, based on Rambam and Magen Avraham. Now, these sources, Rambam and Magen Avraham, are the same sources that the Rebbe relied on, and it's quite likely, considering that the Mishnah Brura is written after the Alter Rebbe, that the Mishnah Brura himself relied on the Alter Rebbe to come to this conclusion that the biblical mitzvah is fulfilled in Ma'ariv. Number 2, he cites the Dirshu edition of the Mishnah Brura, quotes the Chassam Sofer, suggests that the man have the intention of fulfilling the biblical obligation at the meal and not during the prayer. So the Chassam Sofer is saying that you have to actually have in mind
which one are you going to choose?
Which one are you going to choose to be the biblical one? So again, my suggestion completely skirts this issue, right? Because if the Chassam Sofer is correct, that would mean most people who are unaware of this just by default fulfill their obligation in Ma'ariv. And then their whole Kiddush at Friday night meal is rabbinic, running into all kinds of other issues.
Yours is more like...
And mine is implied, correct? It's a built-in condition. You don't have to worry about it. It's a built-in condition based on the way the sages instituted how you run your Friday night.
Oscillate at any moment.
Correct, based on what the sages instituted to cover your needs. Whereas Chassam Sofer seems to, I didn't look up the sources, I'm relying on Rabbi Gimple here, that you need intent beforehand. And my suggestion completely skirts that issue. And finally, the Aruch HaShulchan, who points out that if a husband has fulfilled his obligation to prayer, then at Kiddush, his obligation is rabbinic. And the obligation of his wife is biblical. Has he done Ma'ariv already? She didn't. Right?
So he can't then.
But the Aruch HaShulchan continues. However, he can't fulfill his wife's obligation because all Jews are responsible for another in terms of mitzvahs. In addition, the husband can follow the Chassam Sofer, and then his obligation is biblical like his wife.
Sort of seems like
It's exactly so. My suggestion avoids this issue as well.
Yeah.
Right. And now we're going to see another situation in which, in Halacha 7, we'll see again how my suggestion solves another problem. And I think, again, this requires much more further investigation. And I think as we go through the Alter Shulchan Aruch, we have to look out for when there would be applied relevance to my suggestion and see if it actually holds up to scrutiny. But so far, I think this is the correct way of thinking about it.
I think it says in the Chumash that God gave when he gave the oral law.
Yeah.
He told Moshe that leave it to the sages and let them figure it out.
Certain issues, yeah.
Yeah. So aren't all the biblical commandments semi-biblical?
Okay, I don't want to go down to discussion right now because it's much broader than the discussion at the moment. But suffice to say that when the sages extrapolate from the text, it's biblical. When they add explicitly extra textual, it's rabbinic. So if the sages are using systems to extract from the actual text, in most instances it's biblical. But this is much more complicated than the simplification I just made, but we're going to leave that alone for now. Okay, Halacha 7, and let's keep what we just discussed in mind.
Okay.
A child who's already 13 years old, okay, a young boy. Now, he's bar mitzvah already. He's 13. Now, we don't know if literally he has grown 2 hairs. So let's just explain this briefly. A child becomes an adult at 13 on the most basic level because 13 is the age of physical maturity. In other words, puberty. So the halacha is that from the strict letter of the law, this child isn't an adult unless he's manifest physical signs of maturity, which come down to growing pubic hair. Now, obviously, we're not going to walk around checking everybody. So when a child is there are times actually when you need to, for whatever reason, in cases of witnesses or whatnot. But for the most part, we're not doing that. So a kid comes in and says he's 13, we count them in the menu. We just assume that he's 13. We assume that he reached physical maturity.
Biological growth.
That's correct. Giving it to the average biological growth rate, we assume that he's already hit physical maturity. Okay, but now this kid is 13 years old on a day, so we're not 100% certain that he's actually reached physical maturity, and therefore, continues Alter Rebbe, he cannot make kiddush for his mother, let's say, or for another woman. Why? She is obligated biblically in kiddush, bevadai, certainly. But his biblical obligation is only in doubt because perhaps he hasn't reached physical maturity. And therefore he's still exempt biblically from all the mitzvahs. He's only doing it rabbinically as an educated, as someone who's being educated. And therefore she should make her own kiddush. Right? Okay, so now let's look at footnote 25, and we'll see where our whole discussion comes up again and where my suggestion solves another problem. Halacha 25.
Footnote 25?
Footnote 25, I'm sorry. There are authorities who inquire as to what would be the ruling. You okay?
I'm stuck myself in.
Paper cut. So there are authorities who inquire as to what would be the ruling if the woman already recited the evening service, and thus her obligation to recite Kiddush over wine would then only be rabbinic and thus similar to the minor. Now, the same question could apply to an adult man. I davened Ma'ariv. I biblically did my mitzvah. Can a child make Kiddush for me now at the table? We're both equally rabbinic, is it not?
Well, that's the issue.
So
Your issue is that it's rabbinic.
So that's why I solved the issue. Because this is the question they're asking. The halach is telling us that a 13-year-old boy shouldn't do it for a woman because her obligation is biblical, and his might be rabbinic because maybe he didn't reach maturity yet. Well, what if she might have already? Is it not then also rabbinic because she did a biblical thing? So what do they say? They say it appears, however, that the Alter Rebbe's intent is that since the mitzvah of Kiddush has its source in the Torah, a woman should not fulfill obligation by listening to someone else's obligation is entirely rabbinic. But from my perspective, from my suggestion, actually her obligation is biblical now. Because as per the sages, this prescription upon whom I'm relying, I'm fulfilling my obligation at the Kiddush by the meal. So I've skirted this issue as well. Perhaps, if my suggestion is correct, then I've solved this issue too.
It seems like by the Alter Rebbe in the previous halacha, 26,
yeah.
In dire circumstance, you can
rely on
the davening as your biblical.
Which means ordinarily I don't.
Primarily, it's
correct. Which is why the Alter Rebbe can state here unequivocally that a woman shouldn't rely on a child. It doesn't stipulate, well, it depends if she doesn't marry or not. Doesn't make that stipulation, which is what the footnote 25 is trying to address.
Trying to do that.
So this footnote 25 says, well, the reason why it doesn't make the stipulation is because even though her obligation is only rabbinic now, because in its core it's biblical, therefore, but the way I'm suggesting it, the whole issue is off the table. Because we're relying on the sages' protocol, and the sages' protocol is stipulated that I'm only fulfilling my biblical obligation at the Kiddush over the cup of wine, and therefore she should never rely on a child. Done. So again, my suggestion scores this. That's correct. My suggestion again solves this problem as well. Again, only if I'm correct, and I'm sure there are many who have many different opinions and would disagree, and there are greater scholars than me that know more and would throw my suggestion out. But for the meantime, I'm going to stick with it. And we'll again, as we go along, we'll see if the suggestion lives up to what's being said.
99% of the times, it takes, how long does it take? A minute? Half a minute?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. So she should do.
Anybody can.
Yeah.
Whether you're sick or not.
Yeah. Now it continues like this. What if she doesn't know how to read? in those days, it's just the reality of life that number one, I think they write in the footnote here, 26.
So she didn't do daven mom.
Yeah, the Alter Rebbe was writing at a time when printed texts were far less common than they are today, and literacy amongst women was common. Illiteracy amongst women was common. Okay, so she can't read, and there's no siddur available. She obviously didn't have marriage, so her obligation is still biblical. She can't rely on a child. What does she do? Her husband's not home, whatever. So says the Alter Rebbe, Taimar makata mila b'mila. She should say word for word with the child. So the kid will say yoim, she'll say yoim, hashishi, hashishi, vaychulu, vaychulu, and so on. Yeah. Va'afilum shemayas hakadosh migadol. And now, even if she hears the kiddush from an adult.
Oh.
So this is it. You with me?
Yeah. Okay. Now I just wanted to know whether or not the bracha and the no, because he's still required to do it rabbinically.
The child is doing it rabbinically,
Okay, yeah,
but she's repeating it word for word after him, so she can do it biblically.
Yeah.
So she can do it biblically.
It out,
It can come from a 5-year-old also,
Exactly.
because she's just listening to the
Exactly.
words
And she's repeating it. That's right. Yeah.
In this case, he's reading because he knows.
He knows how to read because he's a male in the 17th century, in the 17th or 18th century, 18th century.
He was schooled.
He was schooled, and she wasn't. So,
Right.
even though literacy amongst Jewish women was higher than literacy amongst non-Jewish women, that's the historical reality. But the historical reality is that many were not educated. Okay, so she's repeating word after word. Now, even if she's listening to an adult make the kiddush, so she's listening to her husband. So there's no problem. He's biblically obligated. She's biblically obligated. He's making kiddush for her, no problem.
Yeah.
As per the stipulation that I'm suggesting, avoiding the Chassam Sofer suggestion that he has that in mind, right? Because he's making kiddush now, and as per the stipulation of the sage's enactment, he's fulfilling his obligation now biblically, just like she is. So he's making kiddush for her, no problem. Like we all do for our wives at Friday night, yeah. Nevertheless, if she doesn't understand what's being said, she doesn't understand Lashon Kodesh, she doesn't understand the holy language, she doesn't understand the Hebrew, she should say word for word. Now, have you ever done this with your wife? Because the assumption is she understands the content of the bracha, even if she doesn't understand word for word. So if you look at footnote 27, he says, if she doesn't understand Lashon HaKodesh, she should say word for word as has been explained in chapter 193. Now let's look at footnote 27. It's a longer footnote, but let's read it. Okay. Apparently, footnote 27 we're looking at. Apparently, large portions of that section of the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch are not extant. Unfortunately, a lot of the Alter Rebbe's manuscripts have been lost, and we're missing quite a few chunks of the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch. At any rate, unlearned people. Now, okay, in subsection 1 there, he refers to section 185.1, which states, quote, unlearned people who do not understand the holy tongue are obligated to recite grace, benching, in a language that they understand, and not in the holy tongue, right? This comes from Saita. Remember, we learned in Saita the laws about when you're allowed to use other languages. Mm-hmm. So here's a person who doesn't understand Lashon HaKodesh. This opinion says not only he may use other language, this opinion says he must use another language. Because if you don't understand Lashon Kodesh, what are you doing? Right? So he goes on to say, similarly, they may not fulfill their obligation by listening to the blessing recited in the holy tongue by the leader of the grace in a zimun. Instead, they should recite the grace themselves in a language that they understand. So this opinion says that if a person doesn't understand Lashon HaKodesh, doesn't understand the Hebrew, he should not bench in Hebrew. He should specifically bench in a language he understands.
And not hear it from
someone else who doesn't Lashon HaKodesh either. This is one opinion. Other authorities maintain that a person fulfills his obligation by reciting or listening to a blessing in the holy tongue, even if he does not understand the language. And this is the common practice, although it is appropriate to be stringent and follow the first opinion. Okay, so the halacha remains that a person can bench in Lashon HaKodesh even if he doesn't understand, although of course it's best that he does. Now this is in contrast to opinions which say, no, you have to do it in a language you understand. What's the rationale? So it continues. The core of this issue, now this is no longer a quote from the Alter, but this is now the commentary of the compilers of this footnote. Mm-hmm. The core of the issue is, as stated in that source, according to the first opinion, quote, if, however, one does not understand the language in which he's reciting grace, even if it is recited in the holy tongue, he does not fulfill his obligation, since he does not understand the words he is reciting. It cannot be said that he is blessing God your Lord. The pasuk says, "Bless God your Lord. Thank Hashem for the food." You mumbling words in Hebrew you don't understand is not a blessing. It's not a thank you. When it comes to tefillin, Torah doesn't say, "Thou shalt understand the message of tefillin." It doesn't say that. It says, "Put these boxes on your hand and arm." Good, so you did it. You don't understand? So what? But what does Torah say when it comes to benching? Torah says, "Go bless and thank Hashem." If you don't understand, it's not a blessing. It's not a thank you. Rather logical, is it not?
Yeah.
The mitzvah is to thank Hashem and bless Hashem. If you don't understand the words, well, what are you blessing? What are you thanking? You're not doing anything. And therefore, this opinion says you have to say it in the language you understand. You cannot say benching in Hebrew if you don't understand it. Okay, that's the more stringent view. Continues the footnote. The more lenient view accepts the recitation of blessings which one does not understand when recited in the holy tongue, but not when recited in other languages. I mean, if I said it in French and I don't understand French, it would be useless. But saying it in Hebrew and I don't understand, that does count. Whatever their rationale is because as a whole, I understand that the point of benching is to thank Hashem. I'm using the formulation of our sages. I'm relying on the sages' enactment of how you bench. Good enough, even if I don't understand every word. But I understand, generally speaking, I'm thanking God for food. Yeah, that's the second opinion upon which we rely, although certainly it's best if a person understands.
There's two different concepts to blessing, because to the mitzvah, because when you're putting on tefillin, it doesn't ask you to say a prayer.
Exactly.
Here it's asking you
Exactly.
to say a prayer.
So when Torah itself asks you communicate to Hashem, it's not a communication unless you understand. So if Torah says thank Hashem for the food, the first opinion says, well, if you don't understand what you're saying, that's not a blessing. It's not a thank you. It's mumble jumble. The second opinion says, no. You understand, at least generally speaking, we're thanking God, and you're using the text formulated by our sages. Good. So these are the two opinions, the more lenient, the more stringent. Okay, so now what about the advice which is gave for Kiddush? The advice here is that she should either say word for word with the child, and even if she's listening to an adult, she has to understand what's being said. Otherwise, she should say word for word. That's what this opinion says. That's what the advice here is, which means the advice here is saying you have two options. Either say it in a language you understand or say it in Lashon Kodesh. But you can't listen to someone else saying it in Lashon Kodesh. That's what this one's saying.
What's the difference, though, between hearing it and reciting it? In both instances, you don't understand
exactly
what you're saying or hearing.
That's the uniqueness of the advice given here. So let's continue the footnote. The advice given here that the woman should repeat the Kiddush word by word rather than listen to it, even though she doesn't understand it, follows the logic stated in section 185.4, that even for those who do not understand the words, quote, it is preferable that they recite grace with him, word for words, because concentrating and listening to every word of grace is virtually impossible, as stated in section 183.10. Similar laws apply with regard to Kiddush and Abdullah, end quote. So what's the advice here? Why is she being told, say word, if you don't understand the Kiddush of your husband, say word for word with your husband? Why is she being told that? Not because listening is different than speaking. It's the same thing. But because when you say word for word, it's more likely you're concentrating on focusing on the Kiddush. In other words, like this: if I'm listening to him, if I'm listening to him, and I say Amen, and my mind is somewhere else, I wasn't actively participating in the recitation. But if I say word for word, I'm actively participating in the recitation, even though I don't understand. So it's relying on the second opinion, which says if you're doing it in Lashon HaKodesh, you don't need to understand, but it's forcing me to actually participate in that recitation.
Right.
Okay?
90% of the times, what they're saying, when they're saying something, our mind is still wandering.
That's right. And as he says, this is particularly true when one does not understand the words being recited. When someone's talking to me in English, I can focus because I understand English. When a person's speaking to me in Chinese, it's very difficult to focus on the words they're saying unless I'm repeating word for word. And therefore, it's very difficult, right? But if I don't understand, I'm certainly not participating in the recitation. And therefore, say word for word. So that's the suggestion here.
It's kind of like a middle ground.
It's a middle ground. It's a middle ground and a lenient opinion. The lenient opinion, which says you're allowed to recite in Lashon HaKodesh even if you don't understand, is saying when you listen to someone else, recite with them. That way, you're forced to participate.
Just have some focus on it.
Exactly. Now the footnote concludes, which is why none of us have ever told our wives to repeat after us, right? At present, when printed texts are widely available, it is preferable for a person who does not understand the words to recite Kiddush, either in translation or in the original. Because if you're doing it in translation, then you're relying on the opinion which says you have to do it in translation. And if you're doing it in Hebrew, you're relying on the opinion which says that if you say it in Hebrew, it's okay, even if you don't understand.
Because you're reading.
Because you're reading. So do so from a prayer book or to follow along with another person who's reciting it. Point at the words, and that way you're following. However, by and large, leniency is granted in consideration of the fact that most women nowadays are at least somewhat literate and are able to follow the fundamental points of the blessings. So even if your wife doesn't know word for word of what you're saying, she understands what you're doing here.
But she can even listen.
So she can even listen. But obviously, in the best case scenario, she should actually know the translation. That would be the best case scenario. Right. But certainly after all these years, I'm sure your wife knows what Kiddush is. She knows you're thanking Hashem for the Shabbos and so on. Okay, so this concludes our discussion on the question of the biblical nature of Kiddush versus the rabbinic. It's going to come up again a few times, but this is overall the discussion and how that plays out in terms of, first of all, the ma'ariv Kiddush on cup interplay, which leads to, can others fulfill each other's obligation when one person already davened ma'ariv, and therefore maybe he already did his obligation, or if it's a minor, if it's a woman, and so on and so forth. And then, God willing, tomorrow we're going to get to the next discussion, which does come from our Gemara in Psachim, which is the priorities of if a person has very little funds, what should he prioritize? His meal, his day Kiddush, his night meal, his day meal, bread versus extra side dishes. We're going to get into all of that, God willing, tomorrow, much of which comes from our Gemara in Psachim.
Thank you.
Wonderful day, Yidden.